Audiobook and Sapience Institute present Nihilism and Islam, My Poison and My Cure. Written by Yusuf Ponders. Narrated by David Williamson. Part 2. The Causes and Effects of Nihilism. The rise of post-truth. It is this historical movement that I have just been describing in the previous section, especially from the beginning of the Enlightenment period through to the widespread loss of faith, which can be said to have led to what is now described as the post-truth era. Expressing concern, the Guardian newspaper writes, "In our new normal, experts are dismissed and alternative facts flagrantly offered. This suspicion of specialists is part of a bigger problem. We have entered a strange period where the commitment to truth, inherited from Christian roots, has revealed a seemingly unavoidable skepticism which spawns out of the issues surrounding the nature of having to trust the experts. Trust is a central feature of any society. The average citizen does not have the time or the ability to understand the often esoteric nature of the fields that experts study in great depth and for long periods of time. They must therefore have faith in them for any relationship between the two parties to function productively. That is, of course, so long as these experts are in fact trustworthy. This relationship always leaves open the possibility of trust being abused via manipulation and corruption, as the laymen do not have the knowledge or the ability to recognize when this trust has been violated to call it out. This is an ever-present threat in all societies. The issues surrounding corruption and dishonesty have become more apparent because of direct access to sources of information like the Internet. Organizations such as WikiLeaks and others have released a plethora of information exposing the corruption that is commonplace within governments and corporations alike. Such revelations have had a huge impact on the overall trust in the U.S. government, for example, with the percentage of people who trust them dropping from nearly 80% in the 1960s to less than 20% in the present day. If one scandal after another is constantly being uncovered and publicized all over the Internet, it is understandable that this would have major effects on the levels of trust. Societal exhaustion. It is understandable, with the conditions that I have outlined thus far in place, that this could lead to the rise of what I will call a societal exhaustion. That is, the collective mental fatigue and confusion brought about by there being too many varying opinions on too many subjects, expressed by too many experts. This makes many people feel incapable of finding the truth, and so in large numbers give up on being able to obtain it at all, or they fall into some form of relativism. Hence the popularization of phrases like, "my truth." This makes many people feel incapable of finding the truth, and so in large numbers give up on being able to attain it at all, have now been put into question. In academia, all of that which was previously taken for granted has been dissected and analyzed. The discussion for the justification or dismissal of such ideas has become increasingly complex and esoteric. Furthermore, when these discussions take place in the public sphere, it often becomes heated and controversial, as if the mental energy required to cover such topics was not demanding enough. Throwing anxiety into the mix certainly does not help matters improve. This is especially the case for those who have jobs to hold, families to spend time with, and rest to catch up on, all while having very little time to cover these hot topics extensively enough to grasp them sufficiently. These subjects can be difficult for dedicated academics, let alone the public. How can they be expected to absorb all of this during a fiery discussion on evening television after a long, hard day at work? The issue here is further amplified when those on either side of the debate are trying to get the intended audience to incline towards the position they are propagating, and not for a position of admitting your own inability to comprehend the problems at hand, in the little time you have been given to explore it. Therefore, if the public does incline to one position or the other, they are not doing so out of having knowledge, but rather out of being persuaded via the most appealing rhetoric. Truth under these conditions becomes democratic in a problematic way, because the populace is being led to hold opinions, not knowledge, about subjects they know nearly nothing about. All of this is coupled with the fact that we have all been overwhelmed by the mass of information available on the internet. This relatively new resource is so large that it is beyond the capacity of the collaborative efforts of everyone on the planet to be able to process comprehensively. This inability to process the information would necessarily make establishing what the truth is even more difficult. Furthermore, we may know more now than we have ever known in the past about the natural world, but every answer has brought with it many more questions. Paradoxically, we now know that we do not know much more than we have ever previously been able to imagine. In the pursuit of truth, instead of making life and the world more intelligible or clear, there are very good grounds for the argument that this pursuit has only made it even more confusing and harder to grasp, intensifying its mystery, complexity, and leaving the average person less sure about themselves and their place in the universe, whatever these things are. Hence why it can be said that the higher value, truth, has undermined itself. The pursuit of truth has led to an overabundance of information that we are completely incapable of processing sufficiently enough to be able to say we have any idea of what's going on. Overwhelmed by overabundance. I will now explore how this overabundance can motivate the onset of nihilism. In the 1970s, the author Alvin Toffler mentioned some of the predictions people had made about the trajectory of the future. He points to the thought of a few individuals who saw the rise of an increasingly standardized culture, and makes special mention of the thought of Jacques Ellul. According to Ellul, man was far freer in the past when choice was a real possibility for him. By contrast, today, the human being is no longer in any sense the agent of choice. And, as for tomorrow, in the future, man will apparently be confined to the role of a recording device. Robbed of choice, he will be acted upon, not active. He will live, Ellul warns, in a totalitarian state run by a velvet-gloved Gestapo. Now, although I can be sure that many people would still think Ellul was onto something here, I think Toffler had a very good counterargument. Contrary to Ellul, Toffler thought the issue for the future had less to do with the absence of choices, but rather the overabundance of choices, to the extent that it causes paralysis. He says that they may turn out to be victims of that peculiarly super-industrial dilemma, overchoice. Furthermore, he goes on to explain this concept by adding that it gives rise to the point at which the advantages of diversity and individualization are canceled by the complexity of the buyer's decision-making process. He happily admits that diversity and individualization may very well have its advantages. People may feel a sense of uniqueness about themselves, which helps to make the choices feel special. However, if the complexity of the choice becomes too much, the amount of stress this causes might completely nullify any positive feelings that may have had the chance to arise. Here he is specifically talking about purchasing items, but this can just as easily be applied to ideas or subject matters for research. To learn about something, you must first choose which path of learning you wish to take. However, to do that, you must first sift through the available options, which are unquantifiable. We see this issue express itself very often within the atheistic/agnostic apologetics circles, when they reject all religions based on the sheer number of them, which I will also talk more about later in this book. It is this which will help to highlight the absurdity behind the naive belief that more freedom and more choices to exercise that freedom with is necessarily a good thing. To the contrary, it can in fact cause paralysis and the inability to make a choice altogether out of fear of picking the wrong one. Furthermore, it can also cause dissatisfaction and motivate the inability to enjoy whatever was chosen, simply because of the ever-present possibility of having not made the best possible choice. Yes, this flavor of ice cream is nice, but what if that other one was better? I want to make something clear. It is very well the case that a limited choice can be better than no choice at all in a good number of circumstances. I do not deny this. However, it certainly does not follow from this that endless choices are necessarily better than a limited amount of choice. The psychologist Barry Schwartz goes on to confirm Toffler's predictions in his book, The Paradox of Choice. In his TED Talks presentation, inspired by his book, he outlines the official dogma as follows, and I paraphrase. The aim is to maximize welfare, which means to maximize freedom and choice. More freedom means there will be more choices, and more choices means there will be greater welfare. He claims this assumption is false and lists a few reasons why too much choice makes people miserable. Firstly, they can suffer from regret and/or anticipated regret, as I've already mentioned. You make a choice, but the other one could have been better. Secondly, due to the costs of opportunity on things, such as time and resources, which cannot always be retrieved again, especially with time. Thirdly, due to an inflation of expectations that is caused by the increase of choice. If you manage to pick something which you think is the best choice, you or others may have hyped it up so much that it doesn't meet the experience that you were expecting. Last of all, self-blame. If it is you that has made the wrong choice, who else is there to blame but yourself? How silly were you for not making a better choice? Oh, woe is me. Now, as I've already briefly mentioned, if we take into consideration the huge number of religions there are, political decisions that need to be made, ethical theories you can subscribe to, or all the other things that the modern person is faced with choosing from, it is not difficult to see why choosing not to choose might seem very attractive, even if somewhat paradoxical. It is simply less effort. Furthermore, linking this back to Nietzsche, we now have the foundation from which this pathological state of nihilism might arise. This choice paralysis, described by Toffler and Schwartz, maps on very well to the characteristics of the psychological exhaustion the average person might experience in the face of information overload. This, in turn, can give rise to the feeling of the absurd that many of the existential philosophers were famous for discussing. For Albert Camus, this was the utter failure of the world to meet our expectations, or the result of the ideals that we have in our minds not successfully mapping onto reality. For Thomas Nagel, it was better described as the conflict between the seriousness with which we took our lives and the ever-present possibility of considering all of which we take seriously as arbitrary or open for doubt. Nihilism as a sickness. So far, I have discussed several important issues. First, I discussed what is meant by the term nihilism and how higher values relate to this. I have also delved into concepts such as higher values, post-truth, and societal exhaustion. I now wish to transition into a discussion on how the nihilistic state of being should be understood. That is, it should be seen as a sickness of meaninglessness and pervasive insignificance. Having understood some of the causes and developments of this sickness, and by explaining this diagnosis a little more in this section, I will explore further in the following sections its effects. First, by looking at the effects of this sickness on ideas and thinking, and then its effects on people and society. Nietzsche referred to nihilism as an intermediary pathological state. This portrays the condition more as a temporary mental disorder that you must overcome, rather than as a philosophical choice made after careful deliberation. It is not characterized by a fully informed rational exploration, but by exhaustion and the immense generalization, the inference that life has no meaning whatsoever. So, it is not necessarily the result of logical and valid deduction, but of a hasty generalization. Most people that experience life as meaningless have not gone through the process of writing it down analytically to work out if they have a valid argument with true premises. Rather, it arises as an experience, as something felt. Many of these people have likely not been trained in the field of logic and reasoning, and so it would be unreasonable to expect many people to be so rigid with such things. This is not to disparage the average person, nor how they approach things. I think it would be unfair, and rather elitist, to expect everyone to act like academic philosophers, and to do so intuitively and without the training. Life is hard, and it can beat down the best of us. No amount of rigorous training in university can equip you to overcome every issue. Not only that, if the person in question here is not well inclined to such tasks, making them go through such a process might only worsen their condition, rather than to alleviate it. If someone is struggling with a sense of meaninglessness and helplessness, throwing too much philosophical jargon around is not going to be the best course of action for them. We must endeavor to navigate this carefully, and be empathetic to the individuals we have to deal with, and be sure to carve out a clear path to higher ground where careful deliberation can take place. The onset of nihilism is induced. It is a pathological state caused by mental exhaustion, but it is still something that can be overcome, not something we should aim to exasperate. Nietzsche himself saw nihilism as something that needed to be overcome, and not a state you should remain in. Nature abhors a vacuum, as they say. But we must ask the question, is there anything else that causes the feelings of the meaninglessness of life to arise? The author Philip Phoenix, in his book Realms of Meaning, points out several factors which are a threat to the experience of meaning and significance. He says the perennial threat to meaning is intensified under the conditions of modern industrial civilization, and goes on to list 4 factors which lead to this intensification. That is, 1. The spirit of criticism and skepticism which dominate the domains of science and philosophy, among many other fields. 2. The tendency towards depersonalization and the fragmenting of complex societies due to industrialization and alienation. 3. Overabundance of both things and information, inevitably overwhelming the modern citizen. 4. Rapid rates of change which leave a constant feeling of impermanence and lack of security. According to Phoenix, all these factors combined contribute to an overall increased sense of meaninglessness and the experience of a lack of significance. Unfortunately, all of this can potentially further contribute to rates of suicide, depression, and substance abuse in a society. This would no doubt likely further contribute to the sense of nihilism that prevails over all those affected by the increase of such things happening around them. A nasty feedback loop, to say the least. You might also notice that the 4 factors listed here are much more prevalent today than they were in the 1960s when Phoenix published his book. Although they were still very relevant then, the conditions he has outlined have only intensified as time progressed. Truth and Techno-Hypnosis. It was naively thought that the pursuit for as much truth as possible would certainly be a benefit for society. However, it seems mainly to have led to a thirst for advances in technology, which make life more convenient and increases our leisure opportunities, without ever asking if this should necessarily be considered a benefit, nor consider its potentially negative effects. One such type of consequence is the techno-hypnosis offered through technological escapism, as outlined in the work of the author Nolan Gertz, in his book Nihilism and Technology. This idea is linked to what Nietzsche refers to as self-hypnosis, wherein the human being turns to technology to zone out from reality. That is, to be completely distracted, to avoid life and being human. Many people appear to have developed a desire to avoid the burden of consciousness and having to think too deeply about the big questions on life and existence. Instead, we turn to things like Netflix, YouTube, or social media to facilitate a self-inflicted hypnosis. The task of trying to figure out exactly what is going on is daunting and has no end in sight. Engaging in petty tasks which distract us from such burdens is a very effective way of avoiding having to give focus to the burdens of consciousness altogether. You need only to look at what pop culture is currently pouring out to meet the demands of the public desire to zone out and forget about their problems. Reality TV shows, prank YouTube channels, the gaming industry, etc. All of this, and more, offers a great deal of mind-numbing entertainment for the needs of the modern populace. We mined the world for information and have amassed more than we ever thought possible. Yet the average person is still more enamored by illusion and fantasy. They appear to be more ready and eager to escape reality, not immerse themselves in it. We set out in search of truth and became overwhelmed and confused by it. So now the average person seeks comfort elsewhere by hiding from it. Like those who are mentioned in Plato's cave analogy, who hate the one that tries to remove them from their chains. The issue here is that this technological escapism hardly offers the individuals who engage in it the opportunity to feel any significance or any genuine sense of meaning in their lives. As mentioned at the beginning of this book, it is heartbreaking that one of the leading causes of death in young people is suicide. On average, someone ends their life once every 40 seconds. And for every person that has successfully killed themselves, there are even more who have attempted suicide. Alongside this, rates of depression and anxiety are on the increase, and it is said that parallel lines of evidence indicate that modernization is generally associated with higher rates of depression. So we have more truths than ever before, and we have now obtained truths about how the industrialized collection of these truths has led to conditions which increase the general standards of living, yet at the same time also, paradoxically, leads to increases in suicide and the deteriorating mental health. Thus, increasing a reliance on effective means of escaping having to face our mortality and problems by immersing ourselves in brain-dead technological escapism. This again gives rise to further questions. If we are so busy trying to escape the burden of consciousness via technology, does this have any effect on our sense of duty to society? Does this escapism not also mean to escape our community? Is society, and the people that make it up, not necessarily a part of the reality we are avoiding? Society, obligation, and duty. It follows that if we see the world as something that we need to escape, we are necessarily escaping the people that populate that world, as the two are intimately connected. The German philosopher Martin Heidegger, in his work Being and Time, describes the human as a being that is a being in the world. That is, we do not simply exist in the world like a thing or an object exists in it. The way you or I exist in the world is not equivalent to the way chocolates exist in a box. To describe the human being in such a way completely misses something fundamental that makes the human distinct. Describing this, William Large says, "To think of our world in this way would be to confuse our way of being with the being of things, which is precisely what we should not do. I do not exist in the same way as the glass does. There is no doubt that I can be treated that way. In a certain way of looking at things, I too can appear as a thing. Seen in a photograph, I might seem to a casual observer to be merely in a room in the same way that water is in a glass. Even here it is possible to look at the picture in a different way. The expression of my face might tell you how I felt at the time. Perhaps I look miserable or uncomfortable. Perhaps my world was not quite right with me. The expression, my world, and the fact you understand it in a certain way, already tells you there is quite a difference between me and the water in the glass. In what sense can we say the water has its own world? Yet it is very easy for us to think about ourselves and others in this way. What else am I asking about when I meet you in the street and say, "How are you?" Am I not asking about your world? We recognize this of ourselves, fundamentally, and of others. The very nature of our being demands we recognize this fact. We have our worlds, our perspectives, our unique subjectivities. A further thing that Heidegger recognizes in his work is that attached to this notion of being in the world is also the idea that we are a being with others. That is, we have an inescapable relation to the way we are in the world with other people, and it is a part of what it means to be me. I cannot escape the other. Even when alone, we are only alone insofar as we recognize the other is absent. Now, if the human being is trying to escape the burden of consciousness by escaping the world into artificial forms of entertainment, then they are necessarily escaping their relation to other human beings, which are intimately tied to our experience of the world. You may argue in retort to this that there are still others present in this escape, be that the actors in films or characters in games. However, the important difference here is any relation with such others is artificial and one way. They may impact us, and we may see them and hear them, but it does not occur the other way around. In this escape from the world, and inevitably the escape from others, you are potentially removing any sense of duty towards the community as well. With the rise of convenience technology, there is a rise in the physical isolation of people. Cars isolate us from each other on our journeys and leave us stuck in our own little bubbles. Public transport is filled with people glued to their mobile devices with earphones in, occupying our sight and hearing, and letting the other fade away into the background. There is a decrease in communal religious gatherings in the West, which are rapidly being replaced with weekend binges fueled by alcohol and drugs. In the UK alone, there are over 500,000 dependent drinkers, and in a survey reported by The Independent, 68% of those questioned described their neighbors as strangers, and 73% said they did not know their neighbors' names. People don't know the names of the people who live next door, but they know the names of the celebrities that populate their shows, and probably know more about their lives than people who live close enough to hear you scream for help were you ever in trouble. This is a huge problem, but a very telling one with regards to our relationship to technology and our sense of duty to those around us. Earlier on, I made a particular focus on truth as a higher value to show that societies must orient themselves according to the things that they value the most. That may be truth, but it could also be the good of the community, pleasure, freedom, reason, security, etc. Once the values have been established, the society must then move towards the goals that help achieve the manifestation of those values. These concepts and ideas become the foundation for everything that begins to develop out of these communities. However, they are ultimately underpinned by the belief that such values are a moral duty upon the individuals that make up the community, and it is that which binds them together as a collective. For truth to be a higher value, it must first be seen as good. That is, it must be something desired, and considered to be beneficial in one way or another. However, if at any point truth is shown to be detrimental, what motivation remains to hold truth with such high regard? What moral duty binds the people to truth when it ceases to benefit them? From the perspective of a society that has lost faith in their foundational traditions, and who have removed God from their social sphere, the motivating factors that necessarily commit people to truth, such as fear of eternal punishment, are no longer present. The same can be said with regards to the fear of punishment for the sin of committing suicide. In a secular world, the loss of God in the hearts of people can be accompanied by a rise in doubts and skepticism. This also opens the door to thoughts of what one is potentially missing out on. If there is no afterlife, no ultimate accountability, why should someone necessarily care about justice, truth, or the community at large? Especially if these things require great sacrifice from the individual, that get in the way of experiencing intense pleasure and doing what you really want to do. Take the words of the popular YouTube channel Kurzgesagt, for example, where in a video on the subject of optimistic nihilism, they say, "You only get one shot at life," which is scary, but it also sets you free. If the universe ends in heat death, every humiliation you suffer in your life will be forgotten. Every mistake you made will not matter in the end. Every bad thing you did will be voided. If our life is all we get to experience, then it's the only thing that matters. If the universe has no principles, the only principles relevant are the ones we decide on. Emphasis mine. The above quote was taken from a video that has so far received over 16 million views and over 900,000 likes, along with tens of thousands of comments of praise. It can hardly be said to be an insignificant movement that is not worthy of attention. Nihilism has clearly taken a hold of popular consciousness, and videos such as the one I have referenced are attempts to combat this reality. However, I would like to draw attention to the fact that the quote itself expresses some troubling remarks. These remarks have inferences that help us to better understand the core of this philosophy. If every mistake you make will not matter, then why worry about making mistakes? If every bad thing you did will be voided, then why not do bad things? What does bad even mean? Does it even exist? If our life is the only thing that matters, then why should anyone necessarily care about the lives of other people? Recently, there was a video going viral on social media of a man who covered a kitten in fuel and set it on fire, only to watch and record it run around in the dark hopelessly until it burned to death. If the perpetrator of this heinous crime was to watch Kurzgesagt's video, would it help convince him that he should feel guilt or remorse for what he did? Or rather, would it only increase his sense of security that in the end every bad thing he did will be voided, and that he has nothing to worry about? After all, this optimistic nihilism has set him free. I do not think Kurzgesagt had such people in mind when making this video, but nonetheless, such viewers are certainly going to find them relieving, if not comforting. And these kinds of viewers most certainly exist. Every year globally, there are around 400,000 homicides. That's a lot of murderers. Not to mention the psychopaths that simply hurt others without killing them. Furthermore, commitment to truth for such individuals would not necessarily be beneficial at all. If truth is an obstacle for benefit or gain, or it was to take away their freedom, then why would they necessarily feel the need to care about the truth? The attachment to truth in such cases would quickly become pragmatic, and dropped if it was not useful to hold on to it. That is, it would be accepted on the basis that it works towards a certain end. It is important to note and emphasize here that I am in no way claiming that everyone who is secular or nihilistic, knowingly or unknowingly, would necessarily become psychopaths like the gentleman I have mentioned above. This is clearly an absurd conclusion. The point of mentioning this is simply to outline that the creators of this video have taken a very naive and idealistic approach to nihilism and towards their perception of their audience. They have clearly not considered the potential implications of this thought process, and have failed to justify why anyone should necessarily be empathetic towards others at all. What they have espoused is fertile grounds for a selfish philosophy, or other systems of thought centered around the will to power. A fractured society. The emphasis on valuing freedom and individuality in the Western world has led to portions of the society moving in very different directions on several different subjects. As an example, a study by Pew Research has shown that from 1994 to 2014, the U.S. has become more divided as time has moved forward. There is significantly less political overlap or common agreement between different parties now than there was over 20 years ago. A people can only move forward together towards something collectively if they can agree on what to aim at and how to achieve it. Historically, that collective aim would be encapsulated by the tradition. Now, however, with an emphasis on the rejection of tradition and a focus on more self-centered philosophies, how can there be any collective aim other than to collectively aim at not collectively aiming? A strange aim, indeed. It is akin to having a car that has a steering wheel for each seat, each connected to its own wheel. This would not be that big of an issue if everyone had the same destination, synchronized their movements, and agreed on which route to take to get there. However, if everyone is aiming at different things, has different ideas of how to attain them, and agreed before setting off on their journey that they will aim independently, then this car is going to have all its wheels pointing in different directions. The result will be that no one is going to get to where they want to go, or they are going to end up crashing into a wall. I would argue this same principle applies to families, communities, states, and to nations. If they cannot be united upon fundamental issues, where can they be expected to take themselves except towards disunity and upheaval? The only real question at this point is, when will that disunity occur? Now, I have no knowledge of the future, so any time scales I give would be a complete guess. The consequences of what I have spoken of in this book may come to fruition in my lifetime. It could happen at some point after my death, or not at all. Only God knows. The affected societies could, at some point, come to realize the error of their ways. We can take the example of the people of the prophet Yunus, Jonah, who were a people on the brink of destruction, but they were able to change their ways and save themselves from ruin. This may very well occur to modern societies as well, and its consequences could be diverted. The people could begin to aim together at something noble and mend the fractures. However, this change may not occur at all, in which case, only God can really say when such fracturing will eventually take its toll, and how that will unfold. In Nietzsche's book, The Gay Science, in one of the most famous aphorisms he has written titled, The Madman, he touches on something quite descriptive of this. He describes a man who is known to the townspeople as crazy. He runs into the market square and interrupts the general populace going about their day and minding their own business. He demands to know where God is, and in response they ridicule him. With this, Nietzsche is trying to show how the modern person has lost their faith in God, and see it akin to children's tales, something to laugh at and mock. However, the madman does not take kindly to their mocking him, smashes his lantern on the floor, and rebukes him. He makes it very clear that something terrible has occurred, and that they do not yet realize the gravity of the situation. At which point he exclaims, "Where is God?" he cried. "I'll tell you. We have killed him, you and I. We are all his murderers. But how did we do this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Where is it moving to now? Where are we moving to? Away from all suns? Are we not continually falling? And backwards, sidewards, forwards, in all directions? Is there still an up and a down? Aren't we straying as though through an infinite nothing? Isn't empty space breathing at us? Hasn't it got colder? Isn't night and more night coming again and again? The killing of God in this paragraph is not meant in a literal sense, but rather it is symbolic of the loss of faith in the Christian world. He talks about the idea of becoming unchained from the sun and drifting out into an infinite void with no sense of direction. Here, the sun is that which everything centers on. So long as we were chained to it, we had something we could orbit together that united us, and which gave us direction and light to see. It was a shared focal reference point. However, after being unchained, the Christian world had projected us out into an abyss. In a godless world, there is nothing left to keep us centered, give us direction, or light our way. This being thrown out into the darkness does not necessitate that we float off together either. Each member of the modern society can be left to float in different directions away from each other. It is this that I say is expressive of the modern, secular, and liberal society. An emphasis on freedom and individual unique expression for their own sake, in conjunction with overabundance of choice, information, and the loss of faith in God, is enough to not only unchain us from the sun, but from each other. Therefore, we have the motivating forces in play for the fracturing of society. Everyone is aiming at different ends. What the modern Western society considers its highest values necessarily lead to its people drifting apart from one another and becoming alienated. Now, we can no longer even agree on answers to simple questions. Who would have ever thought 20 years ago that today we would be watching documentaries of people struggling to explain what a woman is? Who would have guessed that we would repeatedly be handing awards for women over to biological men? Morality, meaning, and leaps of faith. Let us now consider morality and meaning. What role do they play in modern society, which has made a lot of effort to remove God from the social sphere? How does this affect the mental state and the moral thinking of its citizens? Questions on such things as abortion, suicide, sexual identity, race relations, cultural expression, acceptable social behaviors, the role of government or authority, and so on, have a variety of opinions associated with them within the secular Western world. If a people cannot be united upon simple things, we cannot expect them to be united on larger and more complex issues, especially without a guiding principle. If a tradition which binds the people in a society together has been abandoned and replaced with a focus on vague ideas of freedom and personal expression, coupled with such notions as moral relativism or subjectivism, it is no wonder that we see increases in polarization. If the community at large has valued things which lead that community in countless different directions, can you really expect anything other than increasing political polarization? If you drill the need to be unique and individual into everyone's head enough, it makes sense that many of them would try to go in different directions and to stand out from the crowd. As time passes, and considering the different approaches and outcomes of these ideas towards growth and development, it appears inevitable that modern secular societies would end up in the current situation. It also seems perfectly reasonable for the average person to look at this quagmire and feel completely overwhelmed and out of their depth. Is it any wonder that such an environment might be the perfect breeding grounds for a societal nihilism? That is, the conditions where the feeling of meaninglessness can become more widespread, causing more confusion and therefore even more nihilism. A nasty feedback loop indeed. This now takes us on to a very interesting observation by Nietzsche on the issues with morality following from the death of God, where the people affected by it have yet to recognize the gravity of the situation. They are rid of the Christian God and now believe all the more firmly that they must cling to Christian morality. In England, one must rehabilitate oneself after every little emancipation from theology by showing in a veritably awe-inspiring manner what a moral fanatic one is. That is the penance they pay there. We others hold otherwise. When one gives up on the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality from under one's feet. This morality is by no means self-evident. This point has to be exhibited again and again, despite these English flatheads. Christianity is a system, a whole view of things thought out together. By breaking one main concept out of it, the faith in God, one breaks the whole. Nothing necessary remains in one's hands. Christianity presupposes that man does not know, cannot know, what is good for him. What evil, he believes in God, who alone knows it. Christianity is a command. Its origin is transcendent. It is beyond all criticism, all right to criticism. It has truth if God is the truth. It stands and falls with faith in God. When the English actually believe that they know, intuitively, what is good and evil, when they therefore suppose that they no longer require Christianity as a guarantee of morality, we merely witness the effects of the dominion of the Christian value judgment and an expression of the strength and depth of this dominion, such that the origin of English morality has been forgotten, such that the very conditional character of its right to existence is no longer felt. For the English, morality is not yet a problem. Commitment to higher values are themselves necessarily moral commitments. The commitment is made because the people believe it is the right thing to do, a duty because it is good, and followed by those in society who are good. However, as Nietzsche shows very astutely here, when the morality which has its foundations in the Abrahamic tradition is separated from a belief in God, this also separates it from the necessary moral commitments associated with it. These moral conclusions are by no means intuitive, but rather they are inherited. The modern secular world has yet to ask why it sees truth as a higher value, or why the society should see itself as having a duty to uphold truth as a necessary value at all. Holding truth in such high regard is a consequence of the Christian roots of the West. But if Christianity has lost its grip on the people, and they voluntarily gave it up, then the absolute commitment to truth must be given new justification. The same goes for morality, for reason itself, and to any of the values that society holds. But this raises countless other questions, to which there is an abundance of opinions, and even more information to have to dig through. To whose authority do we abide by? How do we justify and establish this authority that once belonged only to God? As Nietzsche says, do we ourselves not have to become gods, merely to appear worthy of it? What do we do when it becomes apparent that such things are absurd to wish for? Furthermore, in a world no longer chained to uniting principles and obsessed with freedom and individualism, to what degree do we apply freedom practically? To what degree do we give up our freedoms for the sake of security and comfort? There is a tension between these two things, after all. Freedoms can conflict with one another. My freedom to do something can take away someone else's freedom from such things. My neighbor's freedom to blast music and party all night with his friends on a weekday takes away my freedom to have a good night's undisturbed sleep. All of this takes a lot of time, effort, resources, and energy to explore and work out. The average person simply does not have any of this to spare to adequately cover these subjects enough. how can they be expected to make a justified conclusion on these complex matters as a whole? What is left for the busy and ignorant, other than to make huge leaps of faith on the best course of action for us all? Leaps of faith are absolutely necessary, be that for the theist or the atheist. Time is constantly steaming ahead, and there is nothing we can do to stop it. The necessity to make choices will constantly arise in life, day after day. When this happens, you need to act. Unfortunately, you are not always blessed with time to dwell on it in an armchair and think deeply and philosophically with a team of trained experts. It may be something afforded to the university student in a seminar, but this is not how life plays out for most people. Take the classical trolley problem thought experiment, which involves deciding whether to pull the lever to prevent the train from killing several people, and instead sacrificing only one. Discussions on this one example alone can fill volumes of books, which would take more than a lifetime to read, process, and contemplate over. However, if this very example were to occur, you would have to decide now. You have no time to think about it endlessly under such circumstances. The train is barreling down the tracks, and if you do not act now, it will be too late. Do you pull the lever or not? Do you even have time to ask yourself that question? Do you only have the time to act intuitively on an impulse? This is life. Sometimes you may fail to make a choice or refuse to make one, but the outcomes in such circumstances are identical to one of the choices you could have made. Failing to decide actively whether to pull the lever or not has the same outcome as choosing not to pull the lever and letting the 5 tied to the track perish. Obviously, life is not always as extreme as this thought experiment. However, the underlying theme of having to act now, without having the liberty of much time to contemplate, is a common occurrence in daily life. This is not to say absolutely everything is a leap of faith. Rather, it is just to say that leaps of faith occur. Nor is this an attempt to put all knowledge into question. It is simply an attempt to be honest with regards to the limits of the human being. We are not all-knowing. We are, however, riddled with blind spots and ignorance. Acknowledging this does not necessitate epistemological nihilism, as it is itself a knowledge claim. If you admit this, you simultaneously admit you also know something with certainty, and therefore admit knowledge is possible. The point of this is just to acknowledge the necessary starting point for all human beings. It is an attempt to get us to reflect on how our finite nature affects our relationship with the world, with our communities, and our place within them. In a faithless society that sees itself as free from God and His commands, that has a focus on vague and poorly defined conceptions of freedom, individualism, materialism, consumerism, and hedonism. There is nothing necessary that binds us together. In the analogy Nietzsche gave, we not only drift away from the sun, but we drift away from almost everything and everyone. Furthermore, separately from questions of metaethics and talks of what morality even is, it must first be decided who is put in charge of seeking solutions to these moral problems. However, modern society finds itself in a strange predicament. We have very large populations living in condensed areas. The city of London has nearly 9 million people residing in it. These numbers are so large you cannot even fathom what this would look like as a crowd stood shoulder to shoulder. To offer some perspective, Wembley Stadium, the largest stadium in London, can hold 90,000 people. You would need 100 of these stadiums to hold the population of the entire city. This is huge. How does this group of people decide who should run the city in a way that doesn't require leaps of faith, or trust in large groups of strangers? It's impossible. Faith and trust in strangers, who have faith and trust in strangers, is an inevitable part of the process. A city of 9 million people cannot know each other intimately enough to say they know the people who run their city well enough so that it doesn't constitute faith, especially if many of them don't even know their own next-door neighbors. The reality is that our condition is such that we have no choice but to initiate systems of faith that we believe best mediate these epistemological issues. This is not to say we should just throw them all out of the window and cease to use them because we found that dirty word. Faith is an inescapable part of life. I accept and understand that, and so should you. However, I see it as a growing issue that many fail to see the necessity of faith in everyday life on many occasions, and naively reject this fact. Ironically, some people have faith in the idea that they don't have faith, or that faith is somehow synonymous with being backwards and lacking critical thinking skills. This is far from the truth. I will now begin to develop our understanding towards a cure for this sickness. I will explore the cyclical condition. Despite those affected by nihilism rejecting religion and traditional values, they still end up looking to them for ideas and practices to make up for the void they have been left with because of that rejection. I call this the Nihilist Yearning. I certainly hope that a deeper exploration of this subject area will help us to understand how nihilism has managed to take as much of a hold on society as it has done, and God willing, help us to understand how to overcome it. The Nihilist Yearning. In an article written by Alain de Botton about why he believes that science could, at last, properly replace religion, he writes how we are, in a glorious and redemptive way, what we always feared, nothing. Despite this being a clear oxymoron, individuals like this perpetuate the significance of the insignificance of the human being, and so perpetuate nihilism even further. The author runs a popular YouTube channel called The School of Life, which has nearly 6 million subscribers. He is also the author of a book called Religion for Atheists, a non-believer's guide to the uses of religion, which admittedly takes a positive look at religion, but is still underpinned by atheism and the nihilistic tendency of reducing the human being to nothing, and then tries to lead the reader to a sense of self-determined purpose and significance, which is effectively telling someone there is no water, and then leading them to a water hole with no water in it to quench their thirst. Despite this commitment to nihilism and inclination to atheism, people are still seeing the benefits of religion. They pick and choose what suits them from it to make up for what they have come to lack in their rejection of it. A type of pick-and-mix religion. We see similar trends in the new atheism movement, with characters like Sam Harris increasingly making attempts to take what he sees as beneficial from religion. This can be found throughout his book entitled Waking Up, A Guide to Spirituality Without Religion, going as far as incorporating religious practices with a new atheist twist. Interestingly, in an article written by The Guardian, Harris is quoted saying, "We need to live our lives with more than just understanding facts. Not being wrong is not the ultimate state of being for people in this life." Related to this same idea, in an interview with the online publication New Scientist, Alain de Botton was asked the following: "Your opening gambit in your new book, Religion for Atheists, is to say, of course religions are not true, and you leave it at that. Does the question not interest you?" To which de Botton answered, "No, because I think most of us don't make up our minds in a rational way. You don't say, I'm an atheist because I've looked at all the evidence and this is what I think. Similarly, you don't say, I'm religious because I've surveyed all the evidence." How interesting. We have here what can only be described as a leap of faith. That is, to commit to something without necessarily having all the available evidence. and not even being bothered enough to explore it. It seems to be conceded here that it's a necessary move for those who choose to incline to the ideas stated in his work, especially when they have goals that undermine themselves and no definite thing to aim at. The only other options are heedless hedonism to avoid confrontation with these issues, or suicide, which, as we see from the statistics shared earlier, is becoming increasingly more troubling. As Nietzsche encapsulates perfectly in his aphorism of the madman, where he boldly claims that we are the murderers responsible for the death of God. This has resulted in our becoming a rootless people. He describes this act as analogous to, and I paraphrase, drinking up the sea or wiping away the horizon with a sponge. That is, he is trying to get across the point that we have somehow achieved the impossible. He further expands on this point by saying that we have unchained the earth from its sun, and now must deal with floating through an abyss without any sense of direction or perspective, with no points by which to orient ourselves. I find this to be a very poetic way of describing the loss of a people's foundation, when they have disconnected themselves to the very thing that grounded them. Like a tree that destroys its own roots with the hope of becoming a greater tree, only to collapse under its own weight and rot. Prior to the death of God, what offered the people meaning and direction was their tradition, their belief in a higher purpose and power. But upon losing that, what was left to keep them upright and firm? The answer? Nothing. As was clearly asked in the Madman quote, is there still an up or a down? How do you determine values anymore? With the loss of any religion or tradition, you necessarily lose the values which were underpinned by it. Some bury their heads in the sand and try to ground it in other things without consensus, desperately attempting to keep a hold of the values they inherited. But up to now, all we seem to have been able to do is create an increasingly polarized society. This polarization appears to be fueled by an emphasis on individuality and freedom of personal expression over and above that of communal values. Although, paradoxically, this emphasis has itself become a communal value, and has thus become another higher value that undermines itself. Furthermore, Nietzsche alludes to something else incredibly interesting. In analyzing the seriousness of the situation with regards to the loss of faith in God, he says, "Do we not ourselves have to become gods to appear worthy of it?" This doesn't need to be taken in the literal sense, in that we need to become like the mythological characters found in the Greek or Roman pantheons, for example. But it can be again looked at in terms of higher values. Where God was once that which occupied the highest place in our hierarchy of values, after losing faith, the people replace him with themselves. Either the community is made the highest value, as you see expressed in extreme forms of nationalism or communism, or the individual makes themselves a god insofar as they see themselves as their own highest value. In making themselves the highest value, so are the related values that stem from this, such as their desires, their wants, and their needs. Echoing once again the words I previously quoted from the YouTube channel Kurzgesagt, if our life is all we get to experience, then it's the only thing that matters. If the universe has no principles, the only principles relevant are the ones we decide on. Instead of the laws being dictated upon us by a higher and wiser being, namely God, we have been left with nothing but ourselves. As de Botton has already alluded to, this is to be left with nothing at all. If religion, defined vaguely, is the accepted rulings given by an ultimate authority, and in a nihilistic framework there is no ultimate authority above your own, then the nihilist hasn't escaped religion. Instead, they become the authors of their own religion. They are left to decide for themselves whether they wish to obey the authority of others or not, whether they are willing to experience the difficulties that follow the rejection of the authority of others, and what rituals they wish to perform. You need to look no further than the popular atheists to see the attempts to build replacement communities that can compete with openly religious ones. They have their replacements for the high priests, who have adoring fans and are looked up to as ambiguous guides. Richard Dawkins is one such figure. His best-selling book, The God Delusion, has sold millions of copies and receives countless praises by his fans. They seem to be completely unaware of the devastating critiques of his work by philosophers of science like Michael Ruse, who said, "Unlike the new atheists, I take scholarship seriously. I have written that the God delusion made me ashamed to be an atheist, and I mean it. Why, despite critiques like this and other critiques, do people still take his half-baked ideas seriously is beyond me. The only explanation I can give is that they are enamored by his rhetoric. As I stated earlier, the human being, by its very nature, is a purpose-driven being. The psychologist and philosopher Viktor Frankl says that man's search for meaning is the primary motivation in his life, and not a secondary rationalization of instinctual drives. The nihilism I have been focusing on throughout this book is not only the reasoned philosophical notion of nihilism, but also the psychological condition, the pathological state, and the mental exhaustion that express themselves as feelings of meaninglessness. If Frankl is correct in his evaluation of mankind, it follows that just as the sick person seeks a cure for their disease and yearns for it with all their being, then so too does the one stricken by nihilism. With the decline of religious belief around the world, and with an increase in atheism/agnosticism, it makes sense that you would see a type of religious behavior manifest in their attempts to flee nihilism and fill the voids that have been left in their rejection of their previous tradition.